The reason that the book always seems to be so logical is because it always begins from a point of reference that is the truth and moves from there. Where we go when we're left on our own without the guidance, the inner guidance of the God self, is we try to go to our perception of what is true and then find reason to make that all fit and become logical. And it's just not there. It can't happen. So that's why he teaches us, page by page, paragraph by paragraph. That's why he teaches us to ask. It can be, but myself I crucify. How do you feel about that?
Well, there is no other. So how could I crucify anybody else without doing it to me?
How does it make you feel about judging someone, anyone, for anything?
I don't want to do it. Even if I judge them in a positive manner, it's still about separation.
It is, yes.
Yeah, that's
It also helps us to begin to get clear where our thoughts are coming from. Because it is suggesting very, very succinctly that we take responsibility for our thoughts. And so when I have a fearful thought about how bad I am, whose judgment is that? Is that God's judgment?
Nope, no.
Sure.
Is that my God self popping up and saying, oh, you really mucked it up this time? No, it's me. It's me making a judgment on myself. It is important to keep in mind that we are the one dreaming about the character that can have an ego, that can say there's something wrong with you. We never make a judgment of anyone else. You see, that's the other thing that this makes very clear. These next 4 lessons make very clear to us. And that is that every judgment that we think we make about someone else is a self-judgment, because we have this ego that is making the judgment has so isolated itself, it doesn't even see anything else. It sees only what it has condemned within itself. That's how isolated it has become.
Someone's attacking me with a hatchet and is going to behead me. Can I be judgmental? Am I attacking myself?
Go back a step, honey.
Okay.
Before that. Before the hatchet ever appears in the attacker's hand. What would make it possible for you to be in that circumstance or situation?
They're robbing me. They want my money.
No.
They don't want my
No,
money.
that's the ego trying again to lend reason to the circumstance. No, when I'm saying go back, I'm saying if what happens in the world is an experience of what has first happened in your mind, then you must have condemned yourself.
Oh, I see. I haven't. Yeah.
You must have condemned yourself in order to have those circumstances appear.
So I'm trying to apply that to my situation that I talked about earlier. So I brought this circumstance about in my life by a belief in my own unworthiness, or
Every sense, every experience of lack, Brian, is an experience that there is something lacking in us. So whatever comes or whatever seems to show up in the world is my image of myself experiencing a lack within itself. The way you apply that in your life circumstance is by watching how you judge what seems to be missing in others. In other words, the lack that you see in yourself, it's the way we project ourself onto the world. So that's the way we begin to withdraw that sense of lack. By forgiving it, so to speak, withdrawing it where we have projected it, which is onto others.
And, you know, there are a lot of very successful people who feel that way. They have no limits.
You're talking about something quite different, love.
Okay?
You're talking about the ego looking at itself
Okay.
as opposed to seeing no limit in spirit.
All right.
Now, in the world of our ego perception, how do we ever overcome what seems to be missing? Not like we're talking about doing it in the realm of spirit. We overcome it by proving to ourselves that we can do something.
Yeah.
And we can do that, and do. We constantly are doing that. We're constantly taking our sense of lack and proving to ourselves that the lack is real by seeming to overcome it with something in the world. So what has happened when we do that? We have Donald Trump amasses a fortune. Why does Donald Trump keep needing to amass another fortune? Because he's suddenly beginning to understand that the amassing of the fortune didn't do what he wanted it to do. It didn't make him happy. It didn't make him feel secure. I went through exactly this same thing, which is why I feel able to speak about it so knowledgeably. I had my own companies, several of them, and experienced great success and abject failure in all of them. Made a lot of money, lost a lot of money. Until one day, I sat back and said, what in the name of hell am I doing? I have done this so many times, and I still don't have what makes me happy. That was the time I came home and said to Linda, honey, I'm shutting the company down. I got to figure this out, what's going on with me. So I'm shutting the company down. And she said those famous words, where are you going to go? But this is a place that we all have to come to. We have to look inside and see that there's nothing missing there either. But of course, if we hadn't looked inside in the beginning and thought there was something missing, we would have never turned to trying to replace it with something in the world.
So you're kind of saying that every perception or every experience of a lack is also a lesson?
Is also,
Is also a lesson?
if we allow it to be, it certainly is. If we try to correct it ourselves, Sam, it's not going to be a lesson. It's just going to be a rerun of what happened before.
Yeah.
It can become a lesson when we turn it over to the Holy Spirit or the God Self and say, hey, what is this really about? Now it can become a very valuable lesson.
You know, that's something that Mary and I are doing. We're working together, you know, with the Course. And I just had the thought or the impression from the studies recently that that's kind of like trying to bring the darkness to the light.
I don't think it has to be, Roger. I think if you let the ego be in charge, it can very possibly become that. But I don't think it has to be that. I think if I were to, again, look at our relationship and what's happened with us, by allowing it to be directed, in this case, it was directed to a very great extent by my finding the association with brother. But that or the Holy Spirit is going to be the same thing. But you begin the most marvelous thing. You begin to allow yourself the awareness of what it's like to be completely loved. And with us, it has been, for me, it has been the thing that has allowed me to really turn within and say, oh my goodness, if this is what love is really like, maybe there's even more. Maybe there's even a greater sense of peace and happiness. So it turns out to be something that's very valuable. And that certainly is not the experience of bringing the light to the darkness. That is bringing the darkness to the light. As he points out to us, our special purpose is finding someone in your life experience that you can look at them and see the perfectly loved, holy, joyous child of God. When you enter into a relationship like you and Mary have, and you are able to do that with one another, where can that lead you except to the grace of God? You can do it with anyone. Some of us find it easier to do it with partners, and some of us find it easier to do it with those who are not partners. But however, trust the fact that you want to do it and are willing to be led. Then how about 197? It can be but my gratitude I earn. Well, you see, that's just looking at the same lesson from the other side. All of the things that I try to do, all of the things that I feel I have a need to become, is to prove something to who? Who is going to love me more? Is God going to love me more? No, so it is. It's back to saying the same thing. It's only me that I seem to be able to make happier by what I accomplish. It can only be my gratitude that I earn because I already have your gratitude. Wow. Do I really? Yes. Yes, because remember, the ego has never judged another one. The ego only judges itself. Yes. So the last line in that lesson, where he says in the last couple of lines, it can be but my gratitude that I earn. It says, never think that God has stopped being grateful to you. But it's not because of what you have done to earn his gratitude. It's because of who you are. Who you have always been. I think it's a euphemism, honey, for that makes it easier for us to recognize that God is appreciative of who we are, of what He created us to be?
How, if you don't do some judging, how can you have to function in this world?
It's a good question, honey. And the fact of the matter is you couldn't.
Well, isn't there a difference
Couldn't.
between choices and judgment?
No, they're all judgments. But there are some judgments that'll lead you to other judgments and self-condemnation. And there are some judgments that don't necessarily do that. They're still judgments, yes. But they're, let's say, light judgments instead of the heavy judgments. You make a judgment when you say, I think I need to go to the grocery store today. That doesn't seem to be too significant as far as leading you to or away from the truth. But when you say, if I don't go to the grocery store today, I'm really a terrible person, that's a different kind of judgment.
So I can make some judgments.
We all will make judgments
Yeah.
because the second part of what you just said is very key there, and that is while I am in the world.
Yeah.
So anytime that you're ready to leave the world, you can start looking at the opportunity to make no judgments. But as long as you're going to function in the world. Now, the way that we can kind of mitigate that a bit is whenever something comes up that I need to make a judgment for, I go to the God Self and I say, help me to see how to make this judgment without condemning anyone.
Well, it seems to me that making a choice is one that doesn't have condemnation or judgments to it. I think going to the grocery store is a choice. It's not a judgment. I don't see how you...
There's nothing about that in and of itself that would seem to injure you
No.
or have the potential
No.
of injuring you. When he learns he has done nothing to forgive, how will we learn that? By not judging others for what we think we see them do. That's the crux of it. I see a little note I've made underneath the heading up here where sin is left. And I made a note that says, then there's nothing left that would oppose love. So when the idea of sin is gone, what could there be that would stand between us and God, our brothers, or in reunifying our own mind, bringing peace to our own awareness? What would there be? And yet, where does this idea of sin come from? Does it come from God? How hard is that to believe? We made it up.
Well, that seems to me it's a logical progression from the tiny mad idea to the world of form, which we then perceive as real. And then we believe that we're all separate. It seems to me this whole course is just about taking us back.
It's unwinding, isn't it? So
Yeah.
just unwinding, a constant unwinding. And then we say, well, that ought to be easy enough. I mean, after all, if what I want is to be peaceful, if what I want is to be loving, then what's so hard for me to let go of the idea called sin? And we won't know how hard it is until the next time we judge somebody for having done something. That's the difference between seeing through the ego's perception and the vision of the God self. The ego's perception always tries to connect things or disconnect things, one or the other. And the vision of the God self always sees it initially as being whole. Everything is seen as one. There is no trying to connect. There is no program for reconnecting. It's all seen the way it is.
I think I can see a little difference there in that don't drop my peace. You know, nothing matters. Don't drop my peace over anything that's happening in the illusion. That doesn't mean that there is no meaning to anything.
Right.
I think those two things really don't argue all that much.
That's a good insight. Very good insight. Where it said, forgiveness will lead you to a place where you can just allow yourself to disappear into the mind of God. And I found myself thinking, oh my goodness, I wonder where I will go. Disappear into the mind of God. Where is that? What happens to me? What happens to me if I disappear into the mind of God? What does that really mean? It's the identity crisis that the Course continuously talks about. But when it says you will disappear into God, what it's really saying is you will have reached a point where you no longer find it necessary to disassociate yourself being a part of God. Not as though you disappear. The distinction between you and God disappears. And so your recognition of being a part of all that is suddenly becomes something that we look forward to and not try to resist. When you find that it's really difficult to forgive, your mind keeps wanting to churn it, grab onto little pieces. It's generally because you're telling yourself that it's you that you want to forgive, but you really think that it's them. So that's the problem to deal with. Whether or not it really is them, or if it's you, or maybe both, is please stop trying to rely on your ego to be willing to forgive. Because it ain't never going to want to go there.
Yeah. That's why. But I didn't sit down and contemplate the Holy Spirit. I just kept saying, Holy Spirit, take this away.
But you don't want it to be taken away, honey. It'll just show up in some different form. You want to deal with it.
Deal with it.
So what's the best way to deal with it?
You go to the God self and you say, as I have many times, you know, I'm rather stubborn about it. Deal with my stubbornness and help me in my own terms to see the best way for me to be free. And it will. It'll deal with your stubbornness. And not in a judgmental way, obviously. But it'll simply meet you where you are. And if it takes a couple of days, or the only way to prevent it from escalating is to let it go. Otherwise it's going to escalate, whether you want it to or not. That's the nature of the ego.
So
The ego will take everything that you try to resist and build it and build it and build it until you can no longer resist it. What you're doing is reminding yourself that the Holy Spirit is going to meet you where you are. And that you don't need to be perfect. You don't even need to be perfectly willing to forgive. But you do need to be willing to go there. Good, well then, for all practical purposes, it's over. It's a very clear example of what the dualistic mind is really about. The Course tells us that there is never a moment when the entire truth, the truth, every truth, is not present in your mind. That's the part of your mind that we call the God Self. But there is the other part that we try to make real. The part that we call the ego. And because we place so much faith in it, the reasoning, so-called, that comes from our perception appears to be equally real. But that's all. But, so please, don't be surprised that you can at one moment be entirely aware of the truth and in the next moment seem to be at a place that is nowhere near it. What you're describing is the transition to the real world. Because we make the world. So as your mind begins this or progresses in this transition, this awareness process, what could the world do except to change right along with it? So it's not as though you would lose anything or drop dead. That in itself, isn't that telling? We think that being dead is bad. So we're saying I would drop dead, which means I would do something bad. Something terrible would happen to me. You see? All of that is part of our belief system and nothing more. Having or not having a body is not something that we consciously choose just like that. Shall I have a body or shall I not have a body? The body itself is an idea. An idea. So as the idea to either have or not have a body, or the purpose for which we use the idea, comes or goes, then we will either have it or not have it. But it won't be the conscious choice about the body, but about the idea of being separate. In fact, I was just reading this morning where the brother is saying in the text, I think it's chapter 27, he's saying, you are very accustomed to allowing the body to be the symbol of your guilt. It's the symbol of your separateness and it's the symbol of your pain. But it doesn't need to be that. You don't need to make the body bad. You can actually see the body as a tool for healing. What you can do is to acknowledge that your function, your purpose in the world is to be a healer. And so if your body then were to take on the same purpose and the same function, you could see the body being an instrument for you to be a healer. And then there would be no reason for the body to suffer or even to die. But how many times have we find ourselves, especially after we begin to study the Course, do we misinterpret the meaning of the body is not real and automatically then begin to think, well, then what the hell do I need it for? The body's not any good, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we're not being clear. We are not seeing clearly the purpose and the meaning we have given to everything around us, including our body. And right now, as we believe that we are a guilty something, then whatever we associate with being who we are, i.e. our body, is going to take on that role of being responsible for our guilt. And so that's that's the only reason why sickness can seem to affect the body. So this whole process that we're undergoing right now is one of trying to maintain an awareness of what the only real problem is that we're trying to solve. And that problem is simply, is there something wrong with me or not? And if there is, then I'm going to be separate. And if I'm separate, I'm going to feel like I have a body. And that body is going to feel guilt. And it's going to then be part of my story of pain and suffering. So, lest we get off on our tangents, we should always remember that's the one issue that we're all dealing with at all times. And all we're trying to do is to approach it from all of these different angles to arrive at the one and only conclusion that we need to come to. I cannot change what God created. I am as He created me and must always be. I think perhaps one of the things that we all as students of a new way of thinking have difficulty with is the feeling that as we sit here together and take in this new information and maybe even change our mind a little bit along the way, that things are really happening for us. Things are happening differently. And sometimes in our world they appear to take on a little bit of a different form. But something else has to occur before a real change, any real change, can actually happen. About 2 weeks ago at Easter time, Brother, as he usually does, gives us a little information about what has gone on in his life as he experienced the same things that we're experiencing, as he's trying to do what we're trying to do. And one of the things that he said that struck me was, he said, I wasn't aware when I made the choice not to surrender, so to speak, to the will of the authorities. I wasn't aware of the specifics of what it's like, for instance, to be crucified. I wasn't aware of, all of the different individual aspects of what was going to happen. But what I was aware of was that it was time for me to let myself surrender into the trust of this unseen inner presence that I had found. And after he had said that, and I sat thinking about it for quite some time. Incidentally, that's any of you that would like to have that transcript of that, Linda's done that and would be more than happy, I'm sure, to give you copies if you'd like. But I became aware that many of the things that I think I have studied and moved toward are also the things that I will only let myself get so close to. That I have within me a built-in sensor that stops when I get just maybe a little bit too close to the total and complete surrender of my perception. That's a little bit scary, my friends. It's just a little bit scary. And yet I also know that until I do, nothing is really going to change. So the question I bring for us to begin to look at today is simply this. Are you ready? And please don't deny what you really feel. And I'm not even asking a question for you to answer here, but to answer for yourself, or answer inwardly to yourself. Do you still resist? Is there a part of you that finds something about totally surrendering just a little bit too scary right yet? Because if there is, that's going to color everything that you do from here on out. So rather than try to move ahead into some new territory, I would propose that we spend the next few weeks, whatever it seems to take, on really discovering whether or not we have these inner blocks and what they might be and how we can help each other to let them go. As I was thinking about that just this morning, it occurred to me how precious this group is because of its determination, its staying together all these years, its innate desire to, no matter what, penetrate these veils that exist in all of our consciousness. And I think that one of the things that we can do for one another is to be with and encourage one another to find these blocks that we're talking about. To admit when they seem to be a little bit too overwhelming. And in the presence of one another, perhaps to experience what it would be like to do what Jesus did. He didn't have that help, so to speak, that we do. He sat by himself for those many days and nights. And when he was walking back to the city, recognizing in general what was to come, my goodness, I can't imagine. I can't imagine the bravery, the fright.
Don't you think he had the Holy Spirit's
Of course he
pretty
did, just
close
like we do.
in his mind? Yeah.
Just like we do. No different. No different at all than we do. But the point is, I have it too. And you have it. But what do I do with it? Am I willing to stake my world on it? Am I willing to step forward and say, no matter what, I will make my choices based upon this unseen and yet very distinctly felt presence that says love is the only answer. Well, I have what he has, you have what he has, and yet what are we doing with it? That's not to say that we're doing it wrong. Not at all. But it is to say, it is for us to recognize that it is because he did do it that we have the perfect example, if you will, that we can do it as well. I just, perhaps because where I was when this all began to unfold, I was on my, I don't know how many times I've been through the workbook, but I was just going past or beginning with lesson 91, right after the review of the prior lessons. And it begins to talk to us from 91 for the next 12, 15 lessons. It begins to talk to us about seeing ourselves, our willingness to see ourselves more as spirit and not as body, not as form. And I think by now we're all pretty well aware that's our biggest hang-up. Letting go of the body, wondering about the body's health, all of those things, that's pretty much where most of us get locked down. So how do we feel when he says, for instance, I think it's either in 91 or 92, when he says, the brain doesn't even think. Your body doesn't feel anything. How do you think and feel about that? What does it mean to you when he says the body or the brain doesn't think? You see, to really now begin to let yourself into that space, you have to introduce a different image of yourself. If it's not the brain that's thinking, well, we would say, okay, it's the mind. It's the mind that's doing the thinking. But if it is this thing we call a mind that is doing our thinking, what is there in that mind for me to identify with as me? And how would that thing be different than me identifying with you? So you see, that very issue, bringing that issue up, is very, very pivotal in our being able to start thinking about ourselves in a different way, in which the self-image has got to change. It's got to change if this is real. If it is true that the brain does not think, let's approach it from the other standpoint. If it isn't true, if it is true that the brain does think, then what happens when the brain dies? Well, that's what we're all afraid of, isn't it? Because that would mean that we would die. If the thinking, aware part of you is attached to your brain, and your brain dies, where does that leave you? So on the other hand, if it is true that the brain doesn't think, the body doesn't feel, that it's all a part of this nebulous thing that we identify as mind or spirit, then who am I in there? Where do I fit in that little niche? So what I'm suggesting is that we can now hopefully begin to identify, to first of all acknowledge to ourselves what that really means for us, and then begin to study from here on out based upon how I can now feel comfortable in identifying myself as spirit, as pure mind. I can't answer for you, but I can answer to you for myself and tell you that all of the problems that I have experienced in the last 2 years have arisen since this issue first came up in my mind. So I know how much resistance I have had. I know how difficult, regardless of the 30-some years that I've been studying the Course, I know how difficult it is to approach that even in my meditations, to approach that time when I would say, okay, let it go, surrender it all. And yet I have watched him, I have seen him go through that. And I know I've shared that with you before, but I've seen him go through the process, watched him say, Father, I let it all go, it's all yours. Here I am. Here I am. Without a thing in his mind to anchor his self-image to. I feel the freedom that he felt, and yet it scares the poop out of me to do the same thing myself. But that's where I'd like to have us begin and do our investigations now for the next few weeks. To see if we can't move past that. Would you like to do that? How much do you now depend upon the guidance that you turn inwardly in your meditation and ask for? How much do you depend upon that? And how much do you depend upon the reasoning, thinking powers that you think are generated in your brain? Well, if we're going to make the transition from seeing ourselves as a physical being to an unlimited being, then we're going to have to get accustomed to going to a different source for our awareness. I've expressed to you before how many people have contacted me and said, oh my goodness, my life is falling apart. I've been a student of the Course for 20 years, and now I'm in the midst of all of this fear and the upset and so forth. What is it that's really happening? What are we really doing? We're finally coming to the place where we are opening our mind to the possibility of another truth. And as we do, that mind, that belief system, that perception is going to come back and say, yeah, but how about this? Yeah, but how do you feel about what's happening in Syria? Yeah, but there was this expose of, I don't know, in one of the programs on television about the sarin gas that the government used on its own people. And how do you feel about that?
It's not real. You got to remind myself of that.
Well, it kind of raises the question is, why am I creating that perception?
Why are you, Sam?
I've been asking that question a lot recently, and I'm befuddled.
Would you do me a favor?
Yeah.
Ask it again right now. But ask it knowing that everyone sitting here is going to support you in receiving the answer no matter what it is.
Well, what's coming up is one of the books about the Course. Most of the book was dealing with something called the wall. The wall. And that resonated with me, is that wall seems to be surrounding my thought process, and I keep trying to think of how do I open up the wall and invite.
Now here's something else. Let's do this. Let's let you feel perfectly at ease in not needing to break through that wall. Okay? There's no need at all to break through that wall, because there's a part of you that's already on the other side. So
That makes
just,
sense, yeah.
just surrender now. Just surrender to that part of you that's already over there. Already on the other side of the wall.
Not receiving anything.
Just let this thought linger with you, Sam.
Yeah.
When you're not defended against the answer, it'll come.
When I'm what?
When you're not defended against the answer, it will come. None of us ever ask a question that we don't know the answer in advance. Asking the question is only the way that we allow ourselves to be open, acknowledging that we can be open to having the answer. So, this is what I would like to have us, how I would like to have us start changing our thinking processes over the next whatever time it takes. When I first began my experience with him, I asked, what's really the purpose of our being together? And he said, well, very simply, we are together to allow you to feel comfortable in knowing me as yourself. Just that.
And that would be true for all of us.
It's true for everybody, obviously, yes. It just somehow feels really comforting to me that I'm not asked to give up my uniqueness, but to see it from the point of view of my willingness to be loving. How many different ways can I express being however I think I should be by loving, as opposed to being knowledgeable, as opposed to being good at doing something, any of those other attributes that my ego likes to embrace. But just in my pure desire to just, wow, if I could know during the day that everything that came from me was expressing love, could I want more than that? How would you approach, if we had let's say we had decided to have a common project here to learn, to bring this group into a place of awareness where we could literally think as one. Literally think as one. Would you be willing to open your mind to that?
Sure.
Yeah.
So you would have to acknowledge that there isn't anything in your mind now that you would feel a need to keep from anyone else in the group. Just allow yourself to be completely and totally open. We can do that. What do you think? Can we do that? Are we willing to do that? Let's make a pact and do that. Trying to keep a thought private is like trying to hide a ripple from the middle of the ocean. Where do you go to hide it? How many minds do you think there are? You don't have a mind that is apart from mine. You have a perception that functions within one mind. And that perception is that you need to be separate and hide things. That's all. But we can't. And when we are willing to let our defenses down, we come up feeling as though we are joined, that we do have a common purpose, that there is some benefit that we can embrace the entire consciousness with. What's happening with our story anyway? This story that we're trying so hard to get rid of, what's happening with it? There isn't anything really happening with it. It's like Brother was telling us in this little communication that he had. We may not be aware of the particulars that our thoughts and our choices, our decisions are creating in our life. But we are aware, completely aware, of their combined effect. In other words, their purpose. And when their purpose is to separate us, when their purpose is to make us feel bad because we happen to believe there is something wrong with us, then they have achieved their purpose. But why did God give us this thing that we call the Holy Spirit, a God self? What is the purpose and function of that? It is to get us past our need to try to escape. We just go from here to here. We invite the presence of the Holy Spirit into our awareness. And when we do, when we are able not to do our own thinking, but to allow that presence to dominate our presence, then we have achieved the goal that God gave it to us to achieve. It is amazing the difficulty we have trying to convince ourselves that this world that we have made, this story we are telling, is not as powerful as the creation of God. And how invested we are in making this story more important than the awareness of the God presence in our mind. Who would you rather trust? The point, though, that we should all remember is, why do you think we're sitting around this table together talking about this right now? And why do you think there are so many others? It's so many, and all over the world, doing exactly the same thing. It's because we, as a consciousness, have made a choice. And we're now trying to justify that choice, whether or not that choice is legitimate to make. That's what we're trying to convince one another of. Is it legitimate for us to be able to decide that we could join? That I have nothing to fear from you? That you wouldn't judge me if you knew my most terrible secrets? That's the choice that we're trying now to justify. It's not about the body. It's really not about the body. It's about what the body represents, the purpose the body serves. How would you feel right now coming face to face with God? How would you feel about it? Take this image into your meditation tonight, or at the next opportunity that you can. If what we're trying to let ourselves be aware of is ourself as a non-separate entity, then we have to recognize that the whole purpose for our thinking that we have a need to be separate is because we think that we cannot be part of God. How do you feel when you sit in your meditation and say to yourself, I am a part of God. Is that something you can allow yourself to be? I wanted to read you the last part of was in this little transcript from our meeting with Brother. I had to say, that when I say to you, the light has come, do you see where the light has come from? Do you expect that it is there? When you do, you will find that it is the only experience you have ever needed to convince you of the ever-present nature of God's love, because you will have seen that without you, that love is meaningless. You must believe in the omnipresence of yourself before the omnipresence of the love of God is real. God's love cannot be real until you accept the reality of yourself, capital S. The two cannot be separated. Can you not see that without you, there is no God? That one stopped me for a while.
Oh, wow.
Can you not see that without you, there is no God? When I say you cannot be separated from your Creator, you must understand that your reality and God's are inseparable. The light is in you. You are the presence of God's love, and so the presence of God Himself must be in you. Nothing is missing beyond your acceptance of this truth. Let this be the time of your awakening from the dream of crucifixion and death to the joy of life, the fulfillment of simply loving one another. It is time to let go your rejection of being loved, for this is the denial of life itself. You crucify yourself each time you let pass the opportunity to return the gift of loving God has given you. Let yourself be lifted now from thoughts that have imprisoned you from life. Forgive your brother for what he has not done, could never do. Trust that the joy of life, which is the will of God, will find you the moment you are willing to have it. One of the things that he tries to teach us in the Course is that all of our experiences are the same. There's no hierarchy. There's no, this experience is different, is more horrendous because 6 million people got killed. And then there is in this experience of you feeling mad at your neighbor because they did something wrong. What we have very cleverly done is to create this hierarchy of, well, we can go play football and give one another a brain concussion and say, well, that was just kind of an accident. And that doesn't mean that I picked up a gun and shot the person and created the same situation. See, if we are able to deceive ourselves in this way, what we very cleverly are able to mask are the real feelings that are behind what's happening. In other words, there is nothing that any of us are concerned about except that we are separate from God and that there is something wrong with us. Sin and separation, as the Course says. That's it. How do you do it? How does somebody in Syria do it? How does somebody, well, we're currently having quite a rash of white policemen killing unjustifiably black people. But you see, all of these manifestations we have given different value to. And by doing that, we make it very difficult for us to step back and say, wait a minute, what's this all about? Oh, I forgot. It's about my belief in sin and separation. That's all it's about. There is no such thing as a little and a lot. There is or there isn't. That's why the Course says that its only goal is to teach us to recognize what is true, what is real, and open us to the willingness to let the rest go.
One of the good practices, if I remember it, is to see everything either as a call for love or an expression of love.
Yes,
Sort of plain.
that's a perfect example, because that just takes away all of the peripheral stuff. It's either this or it's this. I was reading again in lesson, starting through lessons 91 and 92. I was reading where he says, for example, God's will for you is perfect happiness. I can think in my mind, and I'm sure you can all remember, going back through the Course, how many times you read similar passages, that God's will is that you can't die, God's will is you shouldn't be sick, etc. Sickness is a defense against the truth, and all of that. And the thought came through to me while I was reading those. If it is God's will for me, let's say if perfect happiness is God's will for me, wouldn't that mean that in truth I couldn't be unhappy? And the more I sat with that, the more I recognized it is true. The I that is the I, cannot be unhappy. Can I experience anything that is not the will of God? Can I be sick? Can I die? Can I be unhappy? And the answer to all of those is no. Now, that wouldn't seem to be too significant to someone who is going through a sickness, because I'm sitting there thinking, well, if I can't be, why in the heck am I?
Yeah.
Well, I am not. I am not. The ego image of Tom is not the I. And that is the part of us that seems to be able to be sick, to be unhappy, etc., etc. But why is that important for us to know? You see, subconsciously, if we are not happy, what do we do? If we are sick, what do? We look for the thing that makes us sick, the thing that makes us unhappy. And it's not that. That's not the thing that is making us unhappy, that is making us sick. He tells us very clearly, if we were to experience the will of God, none of this would be possible. So what is it that will make me happy? What is it that will allow happiness to come through my filter? What is it that will allow me not to feel sick? It seemed rather simple this morning. How can I allow myself to experience the will of God?
Let go of the ego and know who you are.
That's all of what we seem to be studying, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So I thought to myself, all right, let's have a little meditation here and see how to best get in touch with being the expression of the will of God. And I sat there for a little bit and nothing seemed to be happening. Then my voice came through and said, it would be easier if you began by experiencing being connected to, being a part of the will of your brother. Because that's what you experience in your day-to-day life. You don't consciously relate to the will of God, but you do relate. to the experience of either being separate from or forgiving or being joined with your brother, because that's our everyday experience. So when I could focus on that for a while, then yes, I could begin to get a feeling for what it might be like to be at peace with all of that. So, bearing that in mind, in other words, that what we're going to be focused on is, in fact, hopefully, designed to lead us to the experience of being joined with one another and being the extension of the will of God. So keep that in mind as we do what we're going to do, and let's allow that to be the outcome. You can't relate to the feeling of being separate from God, but we can certainly relate to the feeling of being separate from one another. And we can heal that more quickly, more directly, than being able to deal with and heal the separation from God. So as I'm sitting there, this awareness kind of coming through me, I said, how do we do that? How do we begin that process? And the answer is so obvious, it's so apparent. It's the forgiveness process. That is the forgiveness process. Forgive what you thought you see. And allow a different awareness, a different seeing to come through to you. What is a miracle?
Seeing truth.
Change in
Change of
perception.
mind.
A change in perception, essentially.
Yeah.
Yes. So seeing with vision, what does that do? It changes the way we see. It changes our perception.
Right.
So that then allows us to see, or to bring into our awareness, what is true. And so the miracle, which is the experience of what is true, happens. But until we do that, we couldn't experience a miracle. We couldn't allow a miracle to happen until we were able to see it, until we were able to see with the vision of love or loving or forgiveness, and allow our perception to be changed. Coming up, you'll probably recall in the next lesson, 92, I believe, he makes the statement that it's very helpful for us to be able to, as we're trying to change this image we have of ourselves, for us to be able to get a different feeling for the image other than the body. We are not a body. We are not a physical thing. We've all been through this practice in various ways, but what he's saying is that it's really helpful if you have some other image in your mind that you can begin to use to replace the image of being a body. He doesn't specifically, right in that moment when he's telling us that, say what it is. So I can recall, I thought, well, I better figure out what that is then. So I went inside and I said to Linda, let's do this together. What is the image that we should have of ourselves to replace the image of a body? And we both came up with the same thing. That the answer came back immediately for both of us. You are the light. You are nothing that can be related to in any forms of being limited or in any way would keep you from joining. So you are the light. Do you have any difficulty in relating to yourself as being pure light? I was talking to a friend on the phone about the time of the crucifixion, and suddenly I just found myself witnessing it, seeing it happening, and I saw him on the cross, and I became aware that what I was looking at was the final time before he just surrendered and left his body. And a part of me anticipated that what I was really going to witness was this big flash of light and he would disappear. And instead what happened was there was the flash of light, but in the flash of light came the image of his face, and the rest of the world disappeared. So I remembered that when I had this other experience of that we are the light. That's exactly what I was seeing in him. An experience of his being the light.